The Female Cyclist Series Part 2, Oral Contraceptives and Endurance Exercise Performance. This is the second part of a multi-episode series dedicated to the female endurance athlete, in particular, the female cyclist. On the previous episode, we've talked about the effects that the different menstrual cycle phases may exert on exercise performance, and today we're adding in something to the mix. What about female athletes who are taking oral contraceptives? Are there any differences with naturally menstruating women? And for those taking oral contraceptive pills, is there a difference between the days taking them versus withdrawal days when its use is interrupted? These are some of the questions we're answering today with Kirsty Elliott-Sale, who is coming back to the podcast, and Eimear Dolan from the University of São Paulo. Welcome to Feel the Pedal Podcast. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Feel the Pedal Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on that side, tuning in into another episode of this series dedicated to the female athlete. As for our host today, there's absolutely nothing new. It's still me, Gabriel Martins, that Portuguese nutritionist broadcasting from Madrid, and as usual, trying to bring you insightful interviews with researchers, nutritionists, and specialists on issues related to exercise performance for endurance sports, in particular road cycling. And today we will continue on this crusade for better understanding the female athlete's physiology while talking about the menstrual cycle, as we did on episode 35. Today we're going to be focusing our attention in the oral contraceptive pill use on female athletes and its influence on exercise performance parameters. Something that it's easier said than done, and by the end of this episode I hope you'll understand why I'm saying this. And the idea really is to have you listening to both episodes to try and have a complete and integrated overview of this topic and provide you with knowledge and tools, whether if you're a female athlete or a coach working directly with these athletes. And just before we get into today's interview, let me tell you about one of the best, if not the best, upcoming exercise nutrition conference, which I am really looking forward to. I'm talking about the IZENC 20, the International Sport and Exercise Nutrition Conference, usually taking place in Newcastle, but this year, due to the unfortunate circumstances with the COVID-19, it will be a virtual conference taking place from the 15th to the 17th of December. As in past editions, you will be able to listen to the world's leading experts giving their insights into the effects of diet and exercise on health and performance, and present the latest evidence while encouraging discussion and interaction. Among the speakers, there are previous guests of the podcast, such as Trent Stellingworth talking about periodized nutrition, Javier Gonzalez talking about milk sugars and their effect on health, Kirsty Elliott-Sale herself talking about the physiology of the female athlete, of course, Louise Burke talking about the ketogenic diets and ketone supplements. Graham Close will be bringing the novel topic of cannabidiol use in sports. Dana Liz will be talking about sports nutrition in the NBA. Andy Jones talking about nitrates, and Professor Stuart Phillips talking about daily protein intake requirements in athletes. Just to mention some of the guests and topics that will be under the spotlight at this year's virtual IZENC 20. I have already made my registration, and for me this will be a great opportunity to be on the lookout for which topics and guests to bring here to the podcast in 2021. And if you're interested, the links for the registration are available on the show notes of this episode 36, and hopefully we'll be attending together at this year's IZENC from the 15th to the 17th of December. Now, back to business here, and much like the previous episode, this one is also based in another systematic review and meta-analysis published on Sports Medicine, in which both Kirsty and Eimear are authors. And this paper really aimed to explore the effects of oral contraceptive pills on exercise performance in women and to provide evidence-based approach recommendations to users. So on this episode we will try to vocalize the message by the authors themselves and have their view on this matter. So, are we ready to prescribe training according to your oral contraceptive pill taking days? Can we expect performance parameters to change with oral contraceptive pill use and during its different phases? Let's find out right now on this episode 36, Oral Contraceptives and Exercise Performance, with Kirsty Elliott-Sale and Eimear Dolan, up next on Feel the Pedal Podcast. And for this second episode of our female athlete series, we have with us Kirsty Elliott-Sale again. She apparently didn't have enough of it last time. And Eimear Dolan, who is talking to us from my brotherly country, Brazil. So I'll start with the new girl first. Eimear, welcome to Feel the Pedal. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me here.
It's great to have you here, Eimear. Brian Saunders speaks highly of you, so I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic.
Whatever Brian says is a lie.
Well, watch out. He's listening to everything we say as we speak.
Hi, Brian.
I'll let you deal with Brian afterwards. And from Nottingham-Trent University, we have again Kirsty Elliott-Sale. How have you been since our last talk, Kirsty?
I've been good. Thanks, Gabriel. It's so nice of you to have me on a second time, and it's my privilege to join you again today.
No, thank you, Kirsty, for being here a second time and for your eternal patience. It's great to have you both here on the show after the fantastic episode we had on the influence of the different menstrual cycle phases on exercise performance. And hopefully today we can contribute to clarify the listeners about this topic and have you explain the results from your brilliant meta-analysis. And I'm really excited about today's talk. And Kirsty, I know we have done this before, but for the listeners who might be listening to this episode first, could you please give us a briefer, shorter version of your presentation to the world?
Okay, so wow, who am I? I've been working in the female space for a long time now, so for more than 20 years. I started my PhD on this topic in the late 1990s at Liverpool John Moores. And so my PhD examined the effects of female reproductive hormones on muscle strength. And that really sort of, whet my appetite for this type of research. And, I was drawn in and I've never left. I think the joke is that I've only maybe published one paper with male participants. So I certainly have immersed myself in female athletes. And I guess my work is, maybe could be described along a continuum. So at one end, I am really interested in reproductive hormones and elite performance. And I work on a continuum. And so at the other end, perhaps, is my work that I do with during and following pregnancy. So I really am very much in the female space and quite devoted to female physiology. And so that's me really.
Brilliant. So if the listeners have already checked the previous episode on menstrual cycle, then you know the passion Kirsty has about this topic, and that is surely noticeable by your enthusiastic way of communicating this to the public, and I'm sure today will be no exception. Your turn, Eimear. What can you tell us about yourself, your research background, and most importantly, how have you ended up in lovely Brazil?
So I'm currently working in the University of Sao Paulo, but as I'm sure everyone realises from my accent, I am not Brazilian. I'm Irish, and I did all of my undergrad and postgraduate study in Dublin City University. I studied sports science. And after that, I worked with horse racing jockeys for my PhD and looking at the effects of weight cycling and weight restriction. After that, I moved to Scotland for a few years, where I was a lecturer on sports nutrition, exercise physiology in the Robert Gordon University. That was a great job, great place, but it was a very teaching orientated role, and my passion was always research. So after a few years, I decided to leave there and to look for kind of more research focused work. I spotted an advertisement actually via Craig Sale for a postdoc that was opening up in Brazil, and I thought, sure, why not? I had great intentions of going out, a year, maybe two, but that was over 5 years ago, and I have no sign of me leaving. So that plan didn't age well. I ended up staying here longer than I planned for. But it's a fantastic place here. I love it. My main research focus is on the bone response to nutrition and exercise. But I suppose my research is a bit of a mixed bag. I also have a number of projects alongside Brian in buffering agents, carnosine metabolism, beta-alanine supplementation. I also am very interested in the effects of energy availability on health and performance. So I do have a bit of a mixed bag of research. In terms of this specific project, actually my role was more along the procedural side, because I work quite a lot with meta-analysis. So Kirsty and some of the other guys, Kirsty Hicks, Kelly McNulty, they're the real topic experts here, whereas I suppose my contribution was more along the organisational, the methodology side.
Well, and a very important role that is, given the complexity of this meta-analysis, which makes your presence here quite necessary to explain to the listeners all the methodological questions and possible limitations of this analysis. So, ladies, thank you both again for your presence here on Fuel the Pedal to clarify these topics and to, well, we have already talked about this in the previous episode, but to also make conversations around period and bleeding more frequent and natural given the taboo status these words still possess. And on the previous and first episode of this series, we talked with Kelly McNulty and Kirsty Elliott-Sale about the effects of a menstrual cycle phase on exercise performance. Today, on the second episode, we are going a step further and talk about the use of oral contraceptive pills, aka OCPs, on exercise performance with Eimear Dolan and Kirsty again, as part of another, perhaps companion systematic review and meta-analysis published on Sports Medicine. And as Kirsty and the rest of the authors pointed out on this article, the use of hormonal contraceptives is very widespread in the athletic population. Of these, a vast majority uses OCPs, making them the most common hormonal contraceptives, which means that these athletes do not have what we would call a amenorrheic menstrual cycle, and as a result, these athletes have a different hormonal environment, or pseudo-phases if you will, as they are distinct and in some way artificial in comparison with the physiological menstrual cycle. But despite this prevalence of OCP use in the athletic populations, the effects of OCP in exercise outcomes is still poorly understood. And as we have highlighted before on the previous episode of this series, it's important to keep on pushing forward to publish more research with women, in particular with female athletes. To help us answer that, today we will have Kirsty and Eimear explain what effects do oral contraceptives have and how this altered hormonal milieu differs significantly from that of amenorrheic women and might impact exercise performance due to changes in ovarian hormone-mediated physiological processes. And much like with the previous episode, we will try to answer the following question. Are we ready to design specific guidelines on how to modulate exercise and training according to the use of OCPs? Let's find out. And I have to admit that this was perhaps, if not the most, certainly one of the most complicated interviews to prepare so far. This research can be really complex to analyze, and I must congratulate all the authors for what you have achieved here. So I think it would be a good place to start by having you explain what exactly are OCPs, or oral contraceptive pills, and what hormonal changes do the different types of OCPs cause when compared to the physiological menstrual cycle. So Kirsty, will you do the honors and wave your arms for us again?
Of course. So if the listeners have already heard my menstrual cycle podcast with you, Gabriel, from a few weeks ago, they'll already know that I'm now sitting alone in a room, waving my hands around, because this is a very difficult answer. So I'm going to, again, try my best to use my words to bring to life to you this hormonal profile. So just a super quick recap, that if you remember that during the menstrual cycle, estrogen and progesterone change across this idealized 28-day cycle. And estrogen started low, had a peak around the mid-cycle, drops off again and has a secondary peak towards the sort of latter third of the cycle. And progesterone stays low for the first half and then peaks in the second half of the cycle. So just to remind ourselves, we're having almost daily changes in estrogen and progesterone during the menstrual cycle. So what happens when you take an oral contraceptive pill? So you have a completely different hormonal profile as a result of taking that pill. Okay, so two profiles to mention to you. So one is the endogenous profile. So that's the natural hormones that your body produces, and they're the ones that we talk about in the menstrual cycle. But also at the same time, you have this second hormonal profile, which is an exogenous profile. And that's as a result of the sort of synthetic external hormones that you're putting into your system as a result of taking the pill. So let's start with the natural hormones first. I'm going to try and really just keep this simple and straightforward. Oral contraceptive pill users usually follow a 28-day regime, so a little bit along the lines of that idealized menstrual cycle. And I'm going to describe to you what we call monophasic combined pills. And I'll come back to why I'm choosing that particular one later on. So for the first 21 days, an athlete would take a pill. Okay, so there are 21 pill-taking days or active pill days, whichever sort of term you'd like to use. And then there are 7 pill-free days. Now, in some countries, there are not 7 pill-free days, but these are just swapped for 7 placebo pills. So it's an inactive pill time. Okay, so 21 active pill-taking days and 7 pill-free or placebo days. And of course, adding up to 28 days. So during the 21 pill-taking days, your natural level of estrogen and progesterone are down-regulated. So that means that instead of having those sort of day-to-day cyclical changes, they're just reduced down to a low level, almost like a flat line, if you want to sort of try and get a picture in your head of the graph, almost to a flat line throughout the 21 days. So that's natural endogenous estrogen and progesterone are low. And then in the 7 pill-free days, or those 7 placebo pills, you see, I guess, a small recovery in those concentrations. So they start to rise again ever so slightly, but then when you go back to the first day of pill taking, they're reduced right back down to that low level. And even though there's a slight rise in the endogenous concentrations during that sort of last seven days, really they never recover to the same levels and concentrations that we see in the menstrual cycle. At best, they reach the lowest level that we see in the menstrual cycle. So they're almost equivalent to, if you can remember, during the period, during the early follicular phase, I said estrogen and progesterone were low. So at best, during those 7 pill-free days, endogenous estrogen and progesterone recover to that extent. Now, very quickly, I said there was a second hormonal profile, and that's the exogenous one. So basically, any of the pill-taking days, so those 21 pill-taking days, every time the athlete consumes her oral contraceptive pill, she's putting some exogenous, some synthetic hormones into her system. And that's a type of synthetic estrogen, but also a progestin. And within 1 hour of taking the pill, that concentration peaks, okay, in the bloodstream, and then it drops off thereafter. And so that builds up over time such that the exogenous level sort of begins to build up over the 21 pill taking days. But of course, in the 7 pill-free days, you don't have that sort of daily spike. So a hormonal contraceptive user has chronic down-regulated endogenous estrogen and progesterone. And for 21 of the 28 days of the oral contraceptive cycle, they have an exogenous spike occurring 1 hour after pill consumption. So I'm sorry, I know that was quite a monologue there, but hopefully you can sort of visualize that it's quite different. I think that's the take-home message. The hormonal profile of an OCP user is quite different to a eumenorrheic athlete with a normal functioning menstrual cycle.
I really like what you said there, and I'll try to quote it. So a hormonal contraceptive user has chronic downregulated endogenous estrogen and progesterone, and for the 21 of the 28 days of the oral contraceptive cycle, they have an endogenous spike occurring 1 hour after pill consumption, which makes it quite different indeed from a regular or a eumenorrheic cycle. And just to make this clear for the listeners, this downregulation works via a negative feedback, since what we are doing here is providing exogenous estrogen and progestins. Is this accurate, Kirsty?
Yes, that's right. So it affects the reproductive axis, essentially sort of, I guess, turning off the production of estrogen and progesterone in the eumenorrheic pattern. And as you say, down-regulating it to a much lower level. And this low level is really comparable, as I said, to the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, but it's also comparable to some postmenopausal levels and also to the levels that we see in amenorrheic athletes. So that just gives you, I guess, an indication of this really big sort of chronic change in the natural hormonal profile that's been regulated by putting something else into the system, and as you say, acting via negative feedback and turning something endogenous off, essentially.
Right. Eimear, I'll give you the mic now and start by asking you, what are the mechanisms by which, at least theoretically, OCPs could somehow influence certain parameters of exercise performance, and what data did we have before your meta-analysis?
Okay, so it's a pretty massive question because anything that's going to systemically impact the hormonal profile of the body is going to have a lot of different impacts on that body, or theoretically could have. So I think when you're thinking mechanistically, let's take this in two parts. Let's first look mechanistically, what could happen. To me, there's kind of two main factors to consider here. The first one is that, as Kirsty just said, when you are taking these exogenous synthetic hormones via negative feedback, you are chronically downregulating your endogenous hormonal levels of primarily estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen in particular has a number of properties that would be considered ergogenic, or that could positively impact performance. So when you have this chronic downregulation, when you don't have those peaks and surges that you see in the natural cycle, you also don't potentially get some of these positive effects on performance. There are theoretical consequences of this. For example, fluid retention, changes to the ability of the body to thermoregulate, adaptations to substrate utilization, i.e. the fuels that the body selects, impacts on aerobic capacity, a whole range of factors that could theoretically be affected. Now, before anyone goes and throws away all of their contraceptive pills, I think we should consider that a lot of these are theoretical mechanisms, and really mechanisms are only important once we've tested how they impact something that we really care about, which in this case is exercise performance. I also think it's really important to highlight that, and this will probably, Kirsty will come on to explaining this in more detail, but women take oral contraceptives for a range of reasons. Some women take oral contraceptives to alleviate menstrual symptoms such as cramps, bloating, heavy bleeding, which in themselves could have negative consequences. So in terms of, on one hand, you've got this chronic downregulation that might negatively impact exercise performance, but on the other hand, you might be alleviating other factors that might also negatively impact performance. So the pros in some cases may outweigh the cons. So that's kind of a bit of probably as clear as mud on mechanisms, but some of the factors that must be considered. But as I said before, mechanisms are really only important when they're considered in terms of outcomes that we can actually measure and that are actually meaningful. So in terms of exercise performance, the research up to now is quite mixed, in that there are some studies that show an apparently negative influence on certain aspects of exercise performance. For example, reduced aerobic capacity has been shown in a couple of scenarios. However, there's also an awful lot of studies out there that show absolutely nothing. And I suppose that was really where we wanted to come at it with this meta-analysis, in that we've got quite a mixed bag of research. Some saying that there's no effect, some saying that there might be an effect, some even saying that there's a positive effect. So it's really a mixed bag, and that's basically where we wanted to come at with this meta-analysis, was to kind of set the scene on where we're at, to take everything that we know, systematically and objectively look through it and try to reach a consensus on where we're at.
You've touched on some great points there, and one I think it must be emphasized is that theoretical mechanisms are pretty on paper, but they are only valid when we can actually measure them and prove they work through results from research. And you've also touched on the reasons why athletes take OCPs, which I intended to ask you, Kirsty, so I'll try to merge all the questions I have now for you. So first, what are the reasons for OCP use? I mean, reasons that go beyond birth control. Second, what is the prevalence of OCP use among athletes? And a third bonus question, are coaches educated about the use of OCPs?
No. That was a quick answer. I guess for me, if I could, start at the beginning, the first question I ask people is, okay, do we really need to consider differences between males and females? And if we say yes, we do, and we want to look at females, then it's not quite that simple. So you don't just get a male-female split. When you start to look at women, I think you need to understand what type of woman you have. So I'm not here talking about physical appearance or redhead, brunette, anything like that. But I mean, if we consider that some may have menstrual cycles, some may have menstrual irregularities, some might use hormonal contraceptives, and of course, oral contraceptive pills are just one type of hormonal contraception. So when you turn your attention to females, you really need to understand which type of female you have in front of you, so that you can then understand the hormonal profile. So really the first port of call is for athletes and coaches and support staff and practitioners to educate themselves about all of these different types of hormonal profiles. And then the next step is to track and monitor which type of athlete you have, which type of cycle she has, so that you can then, of course, make any adjustments if they're needed. And so that really, I guess, led us to conduct a study a few years ago. So this is work from my group and some collaborators. And we did, I guess, a type of audit of UK-based elite female athletes, and we asked them to complete a questionnaire, and you were asked if you take some type of hormonal contraception or not. And just really ever so briefly, we got pretty much a 50-50 split. So 50% of athletes said they used some type of hormonal contraception, of which OCPs were the most common type. But of course, there are others. There are injections, implants, and so on. And then the other 50% were non-users, but we mustn't infer that they were all eumenorrheic athletes with a menstrual cycle. Of course, some of them may have had menstrual irregularities. So what we're left with is, we think currently based on that paper, which is now a few years old, we need to keep collecting this information, and we need to collect it in lots of different populations. So for example, we should really collect this information specifically for cyclists, so that we can make recommendations for cyclists. So I think we need to keep pace with this type of auditing and establishing the prevalence in real time. And so when we asked and we got these numbers, one of the other things that we asked them was, why do you use a hormonal contraceptive, and, specifically an OCP? And just like Eimear said, many athletes use an OCP in order to, I guess, alleviate some symptoms, negative symptoms and side effects of the menstrual cycle. And so really that OCP facilitates their ability to train and compete. Of course, many use it for contraception purposes. We sometimes forget to say that out loud because I'm so obsessed with how it changes the hormonal profile. I forget that people use it for contraceptive purposes. And then thirdly, actually, many athletes use it for, I guess I'm going to call it convenience. So what I mean by that is, you can imagine that, in the run up to the Olympic Games, you might like to know if you're going to have your period on the day of your event. And so often we find athletes start to take an OCP such that they can manipulate and change their menstrual cycle, and they can essentially, get rid of their periods by just taking the 21 active pill days over and over again. So they don't take the 7 pill-free days, and they never have or experience any type of bleeding. You'll notice I didn't say that they didn't experience a period. I said bleeding. So in the 7 pill-free days, they have what we call a withdrawal bleed, which is different from the sort of eumenorrheic period. So they use it for convenience. They use it to manipulate their cycles. They can get rid of periods and bleeding and withdrawal bleeds. And in that way, they feel more confident that on the day of their Olympics or their Tour de France or any type of event or race or competition, that's one less thing to worry about. And so that was one of the main reasons that athletes reported for using OCPs.
That's really interesting, and we'll get to that. The prevalence study you've mentioned, is it from Daniel Martin?
Yes, that's right. So Dan Martin was a PhD student of mine. He's now graduated from our university, and he's out in the world now doing his thing.
Great. So I'll include that research in the show notes of this episode. And I really want to insist on this point of the use of OCP among female athletes, which I find really interesting and really provides the rationale for this conversation of ours and the importance of this, because if we analyze the intention of those athletes taking OCPs for reducing symptoms associated with menstruation and the convenience Kirsty mentioned, this really is similar to the intention athletes often present for taking any ergogenic supplement. What would you say about this, Eimear?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, again, women are going to vary so much in terms of their own circumstances, their own bodies, the reasons they make decisions in terms of things like contraceptives. But absolutely, if somebody suffers from difficult menstrual symptoms, like, for example, cramps, bloating, heavy bleeding, etc., that can really negative not only your exercise performance, but your ability to participate in daily life. So absolutely, if there is something that can alleviate those symptoms, that could absolutely be considered ergogenic for those women.
For sure. Eimear, and since you have the mic, we can stay with you and go straight into the more methodological questions regarding this meta-analysis that might be more heavy for the listener, but nonetheless necessary for everyone to understand that this is not just, looking at the conclusions or the forest plots and be done with it. So I believe it's important to talk about some inclusion criteria regarding age, training status, form of OCP used and why, and other methodological issues you feel like highlighting.
Sure. So I think before getting into the detail here, just a little bit of background on this. When you are designing a meta-analysis, the first and most difficult thing that you must do is to clearly define your question and to set up the parameters within which you will answer that question. And this will generally be done in terms of categories. Your inclusion and exclusion criteria will be defined in terms of categories called the PICOs: population, intervention, comparators, outcomes, study designs. Did I get them all there? I did. So the first thing you need to do is to decide basically where you're going to set these parameters, what you're going to let in and what you're going to exclude from your meta-analysis. And for me, something really important in making these decisions is considering where your research line is at, how advanced or how early your research line is at. Now, in this particular situation, in terms of the effect of oral contraceptive use on exercise performance, I would consider it to be quite early in the research line. There's quite a lot of research out there. However, there's not very many kind of solid answers. There's not much consensus on how the contraceptive use can impact exercise performance. So I would consider it relatively early in the research line. I don't know if Kirsty would agree with me on that. So in keeping that in mind, we decided to be quite open in terms of our inclusion criteria because we thought it was important to basically set the scene on everything that we know in this topic area. We really don't have enough information to be very selective in terms of the types of oral contraceptives used or to answer questions such as how training status might impact or not the response. So we decided to be quite open in general in our inclusion criteria to basically just get that bigger picture look at what was available. So in terms of age, we had women aged 18 to 40 because we wanted to basically take out anyone whose hormonal levels or hormonal status might be impacted by either puberty or by menopause. And so we're kind of looking for those kind of young adults. In terms of training status, we didn't put any restriction. We wanted to take in basically all training levels because we wanted to see was there any patterns emerging in terms of is there any kind of a differential response between, say, sedentary to recreationally trained to more highly trained athletes. We wanted to see what was available there. And in terms of the forms of oral contraceptive, again, we left it quite open. We took in all forms. Because we don't really know how the different forms might differentially impact exercise performance, but also because an awful lot of the literature doesn't very clearly define or break down exactly the ingredients in the different contraceptives that they were using, which meant it's difficult to parse that out. So yeah, we were pretty broad because, as I say, we wanted to get this big picture look of kind of this is where we're at, this is all the information that we have, this is what we kind of believe it means, and this is how we can move forward.
Mm-hmm. And you've included 42 studies and 590 participants. And this was the first meta-analysis on the effects of OCPs on exercise performance and the first one to appraise the quality of previous research. And one thing that is common to both meta-analysis discussed here is that there is a lack of high-quality research in this particular topic. And particularly in your article, after applying the criteria, most studies were graded as moderate, low, or very low quality, with only 17% achieving high quality. So, Kirsty, I know this is somewhat a repetition from what I've asked you several times on episode 35, but in this case, this is a healthy repetition because the message really needs to sink in. What major limitations do we still have in the research regarding this topic, and what needs to change for us to be able to produce more high quality research with OCPs and exercise?
Yeah, okay. So I think when it comes to quality, we need to now raise the bar a little bit, and we need to raise our standards, and we need to have, I guess, a basic set of criteria that we use as a minimum, and in fact that we try to better. And so what I mean by that is, so when you have an oral contraceptive pill group as part of your experimental design, it's really important that as an author, you state which type of oral contraceptive pill each athlete, each participant took, because the pills are, there's a huge variety of pills. It's really like going into a sweet shop. There are chocolates, there are hard sweets, there are bitter sweets, there are so many types. And I think people really underestimate the variety. And so, I think in the past we've just gone, oh, that's an OCP user. And, the inference was, oh, they're all the same. And actually, as I say, they're really not. It's very much, a large variety of these. And so I think we're honor bound now as a minimum standard to report which type of OCP an athlete or participant took. And within that could be along the lines of the route of delivery. So whether it's oral or whether it's an injection or so on. Then it's whether it's a combined pill or a progesterone only pill. That's quite important. And then things like what was the androgenicity of the pill. So, I'm really not going to, this would take me a long time to explain, but they have different formulations, and these different formulations have different androgenicity. And if we're theoretically saying that these hormones may exert an effect on a physiological system, then of course, if we change the androgenicity, then that may either dial up or dial down that effect. So really, in a very long-winded way, my answer should have been there's a large variety of hormonal contraceptives, and there's still actually a large variety of OCPs. So we must report to a sufficient level of detail to our readers which type of OCP user we included, because that will affect the resultant hormonal profile, and of course that will potentially affect the consequences of that particular pill type. So in terms of quality, that's what we need to do, set a minimum standard, particularly around the reporting. If I could push that, I guess, a little bit further, I would try to encourage researchers in order, again, to increase the quality of the data and our confidence of those findings. If they could try and recruit the same type of OCP user, that would be great. So what I mean by that is, if you, at the bare minimum, you report which type they took, but that has still a lot of variation. But if possible, try and get athletes on this sort of same pill brand so that you really start to, I guess, reduce some of that variability and give us a more tight, a more robust experimental design. So, sorry, very long answer. Hopefully you guys have picked out the two important points in order to increase the quality of the research. At a minimum, report the type. And if you can at all, to try and get more towards that gold standard quality, try and recruit athletes on the same type of pill such that we can reduce that variability and begin to boil down, I guess, to look more closely at the relationship that we're interested in.
Hopefully with your reinforced message from both episodes, this idea really sinks in and we can contribute for better studies to be performed. Kirsty, again, what a tremendous piece of advice that was. And now let's get on to the comparisons in this meta-analysis. So you've performed a between groups and within groups comparisons. And I think this is really important to put clear to the listeners as to why you've decided to perform these comparisons in the first place. So let's start first with the between groups where you've compared OCP users with naturally menstruating women, and then perhaps explain the within group comparisons where you've compared OCP users with OCP withdrawal. A big question for you, Eimear.
Sure. So, like you say, big question. So basically, any type research like this basically comes down to comparisons between measurement A and measurement B. I think it's really important to highlight that every time you're trying to make this comparison, there are going to be external sources. No matter how well you control your study, there are going to be external sources of variability that can influence your results. So your job as a researcher is to try to minimize those external sources of variability so that you can pinpoint any differences that you identify to what you're actually studying, in this case, oral contraceptive use. In terms of the between group comparisons, so basically if you take a group of women there's a large body of research out there which basically looks at groups of women who are habitually taking oral contraceptives and groups of women who are naturally menstruating. So there, as Kirsty explained in detail, you've got very different hormonal profiles. So you've got quite a stark contrast in hormonal profile that can potentially allow you to draw some inferences on how that might impact performance. However, what you need to bear in mind is if you are looking at two independent groups, there's a whole lot of external factors that might potentially impact your results. So in general, you need very large numbers to be able to make these types of comparisons. Like say, for example, if you're comparing me with Kirsty, you're not only comparing our contraceptive use, we've got different genetic profiles, we have different training statuses, we eat in different ways, we had different night's sleep last night. There's a whole host of factors when you compare between groups. So you need to be quite careful there in terms of the inferences that you make and to be aware that there is a lot of external factors. Then on the other hand, in general, when it's feasible, within group comparisons are very useful. And this is basically where you're comparing yourself with yourself. When you're measuring me today and you're measuring me next week or at whatever time. And obviously, if you're comparing within group, as in repeated measures on the same person, you're taking away a lot of those kind of complicating factors. My genetic profile is not going to change between today and tomorrow. My base training status is not going to change. My usual nutritional habits, for example, remain relatively constant. Sure, there's going to be some variation. Maybe I slept very well one night and not on another, but there's a lot less external factors. However, in this situation, we've got a large body of research that basically looks at a within-group comparison of women on the days that they are taking the active pill-taking days versus those 7 pill-free or withdrawal days. Now, theoretically, this is a very nice model to look at how different hormonal profiles might impact performance within the same person. However, I think where this gets tricky is that although there will be distinct hormonal profiles, in those 7 days, it's not going to be huge. There's not going to be a massive difference. The body doesn't really have time to massively change its hormonal state in those 7 pill-free days, which means that although you've got the control of comparing within a person, as in a repeated measurement, you're probably looking for relatively small, subtle differences because there's not going to be a huge variation. So that's probably a bit of a long, rambly answer. Basically, the pros of having the between group is that you've got starkly different hormonal profiles, but the con is that you've got a lot of external factors that may impact your measurements. The pro of the within group comparison, i.e. repeated measures on the same person, is that you've got a lot less of those external factors. However, you've also got a much more stable hormonal profile, so the extent of change that you might expect will be much smaller. So basically, when we were planning out this study, we knew that there was kind of these two body of evidences that use these two kind of broad study types or designs, and we figured the best thing to do was to look at it all and see if any patterns emerged, while always kind of remaining cognizant of both the pros and cons of both approaches. I'm not sure if I answered your question at all there, Gabriel, or if I just rambled a lot.
Oh, yes, you did. No doubt you did, rest assured. And regarding your answer, it's clear now that both analyses were needed in order to see if there was a difference between OCP users and naturally menstruating women who don't take OCPs, and the within-group comparison to see if there was any difference between the OCP taking days and the OCP withdrawal period. And I'm sure there are women listening to this episode that can relate to any of these scenarios. So now comes the part we've been all waiting for. So what does this mean for performance? And wherever we see a meta-analysis published, it's normal to go straight to the forest plot and see if the average line touches the zero or not, but I'd like to have your detailed explanation so we can see beyond the effect sizes and perhaps even focus a bit on the wide variations in the studies included in this forest plot. So, Kirsty, could you please explain to us the forest plots included in your article and what does this mean in terms of impact for exercise performance in female athletes?
I'm laughing now here all by myself, because not only is this a very visual answer again, it's also on statistics. So you found my weakness. So now I'm waving my arms at the visual aspect, and I'm also sweating buckets at having to be, a statistician here. Okay, so here goes. I'm going to give you a very simplistic answer to this, but hopefully one that is meaningful to the listeners. So for you guys, there are three forest plots in this particular paper, but we're going to focus on the two that make a comparison between the OCP users and the menstrual cycle athletes. So these are figures 3 and 4 in the meta-analysis. The first one compares the oral contraceptive pill withdrawal, so those 7 pill-free or placebo days, against the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. And the reason why we did this, I mentioned before that, they have similar endogenous hormonal profiles, so that makes it a good fit to make a comparison. And also, I guess, in terms of, we talked in the last podcast, Gabriel, about some of the, perceptions and feelings that athletes have as a dual sort of relationship. So as well as looking at the direct relationship between the hormones and physiology, we're also thinking about how the hormones affect perceptions and feelings of the athlete. And so I guess in the 7 pill-free days and the early follicular phase, those athletes are all experiencing some type of bleeding. So either the withdrawal bleed or a period. So again, they may have a perception about how that bleeding might impact upon their willingness to compete or to train, or how they feel and so on. So it just felt like a really good sort of comparison point. And obviously, if you're a pill user, you would want to know how you were faring against somebody who wasn't a pill user. So for all of those reasons, that's sort of, I guess, what underpins this first sort of figure 3. And when you look at this figure, and again, apologies, it's a visual thing. You have this line down the middle at 0 effect size, and then you've got a plus or a minus. So in this case, on the right hand side, and now I'm checking which is right and left. On the right hand side, we have these positive values which favor naturally menstruating women, so favor those in the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle. And then to the left, you have negative values sort of favoring the oral contraceptive pill user in the withdrawal phase. And actually, when you get a chance to look at this diagram, you'll see that there's large variation. So all of the dots, which are, I guess, the central point, and again, I'm really oversimplifying here, mostly because I'm an oversimplified person and not a statuist, but I'm hoping that it also helps you guys. So the dots representing the middle point, they're not in a straight line, showing that all of these previous studies agree. They're actually, it's not quite a diagonal, but it's sort of moving from the right-hand side, getting towards that 0 effect size, and then somewhat going towards the left-hand side. And really the take-home message here is that there's large variation between studies, which makes it super difficult for us to really conclude anything. So the variation is so big. And again, that sort of really comes back to the point I made earlier about the quality of the studies. It's because we're not really comparing apples with apples. Oh, so I've gone from an example with sweets and chocolates to now to food. See, I'm a very balanced nutrition. So we're not comparing apples with apples. We're trying to compare, apples with strawberries. Okay, they're all fruit, so we're in the right category. So we're in the same ballpark here in terms of, we're using female athletes, but we're not really, they're not similar enough to really get something meaningful. So when you look at figure 3, you'll see large variation there in sort of the effect sizes, making it somewhat difficult for us to conclude anything. And then similarly, when you look at figure 4, it's, I guess, if I go to the plot itself first, it shows a similar pattern. So again, we have these sort of middle dots moving from the right-hand side, tending towards that midline, and then some actually going over to the left. And again, remembering that the right-hand side favors naturally menstruating women, and the left-hand side favors the oral contraceptive pill user. And just, I guess, to give you the granular information about specifics here. So on the right-hand side, when we're talking about naturally menstruating women, these are menstrual cycle athletes in all other phases of the menstrual cycle except the early follicular. And this is an interesting one, actually. So I said in the previous podcast that the early follicular phase is a relatively stable phase. So you get sort of 4, 5, 6 days with a consistent hormonal profile. But beyond that, we see all of these peaks and troughs in both estrogen and progesterone. So really, all of the other phases there, it's almost daily changes in the reproductive sort of profile. And so that's very difficult to compare to the oral contraceptive consumption phase, which has a very stable, sort of chronic downregulated sort of profile. And, really we had to think hard here about which comparisons we were going to make. So as I say, in figure 3, we compared sort of relatively stable phases with low reproductive hormones, endogenous reproductive hormones. And then in this next one, we have, large variability. So day-to-day changes in hormonal profile in our eumenoric athletes versus a relatively stable one in pill consumption. It's not ideal, and it certainly is a limitation. It isn't just our limitation, it would be the same limitation for anybody trying to do a meta-analysis in this way. So we did the best that we could, and we feel that, this was the best way to split them. So if you look at figure 4, again, you'll see just large variation in the findings. We're not agreed in either the direction or the magnitude of any changes. So this large between study variability makes it quite difficult for us to move forward with confidence with a definitive answer. So I hope that helps. That's about as stato as I can get. And I'm still waving my hands, in my house alone. I know you can't see it, but it's quite amusing.
Now we have a mental note. We can all picture it quite well, I'm sure. So if we want to try and digest this info, I believe that the variation itself is an answer to the question I made. It's just so difficult to give a straight answer. And even if we have the temptation to just look at figure 3 or 4, for example, and conclude that performance is favored in naturally menstruating women, the variation in the studies used sort of eclipses any apparent conclusion we might be tempted to take. Would that be accurate, Kirsty?
Oh, wow, your answer was way better than my answer. That's exactly it in a nutshell. It's, I think when you look at the forest plots, we can't, allow our eyes to misinterpret. Okay, there are way more of these dots in the favouring naturally menstruating women, and so therefore there's this huge effect. And unfortunately, with the variation, it sort of, as you say, eclipses, it brings us back to, I guess, more uncertainty and less confidence. And I guess if I could throw something in there, and here I'm going to put myself out on a limb, I guess if I was thinking about it purely on a sort of biological plausibility sort of approach, it makes sense to me that, the eumenoric menstrual cycle is what, I guess, an adult female's body is programmed to do. If we're sort of, I guess, thinking here along the lines of homeostasis, we're programmed to have this menstrual cycle. And I guess that, again, this is all theoretical. You're just getting this little glimpse into my crazy little mind. But if we're doing something that changes that, we're putting something artificial into the system, we're blunting it, we're turning it off, we're downregulating what our body wants to do, then maybe it makes biological sense that our bodies, would favour naturally menstruating because that's what we're programmed to do. And I guess there could be some potential for some women, loads of caveats, but some people's bodies may not respond, I guess, to this more sort of artificial situation it finds itself in. We're all the time trying to get back to homeostasis. We're trying to get back to naturally menstruating, on that sort of profile. So I guess in terms of the underpinning or underlying physiology, it makes sense. But there are all those caveats in there that although it looks like this from the forest plots, the large variation, I guess, pushes us back towards uncertainty, makes it more vague, sort of takes away some of the confidence in that statement, eclipses that effect. All the caveats, I'm definitely weebling now. So please feel free to stop me. Edit me, Gabriel.
I won't, Kirsty, I won't stop you. This is what I brought you here for, to freely express yourself. So, moving on, if it's not clear for the listeners by now, there are just so many factors to consider that make any black or white approaches not possible to even consider. And I will turn this to you, Eimear, and try to see if there is still something we can squeeze out of your analysis here. So, if we consider the OCP taking women, could we say that performance varied across the OCP cycle when compared with naturally menstruating women? So again, using this expression from Kirsty, does it make biological sense that the most favorable scenario for exercise performance is that of naturally menstruating women?
For me, it absolutely makes biological sense. Like Kirsty says, that if you chronically downregulate these hormones, that there may be a potential impact on performance. But I suppose when I think about this, I sometimes think about a relatively recent conversation that I had with, there was 4 of us sitting around, and we were talking about our own experience with contraceptive pills and how people on them. One of my mates hated it. Felt that she said she turned into a crazy person. She said it just didn't agree with her at all. I personally used to suffer from quite strong cramps, so I absolutely loved the pill because they completely took that away. And then there was 2 in the group who just didn't really notice anything one way or another. And I think to try to put a single answer for those 4 people as to whether you should or shouldn't be affected is denying the experience of every individual. Basically, different people are going to respond depending on their own circumstances. And so to try to put a kind of a blanket answer on whether this does or doesn't impact performance or a whole variety of factors, well, that's really going to depend on where you start in it and your own individual experience of it. So I think, yes, from a biological point of view, it seems like the evidence is leaning towards favouring the natural menstrual cycle. However, if you're one of these people who's really struggles with their menstrual cycle, sure, absolutely, it's probably it could go the opposite way altogether. So I think you really need to consider the experience of the individual and the reason why she's taking an oral contraceptive and how her body responds. Some women have very strong responses. Some people notice absolutely nothing. So looking at the group, I think this is really important for science in general. When we do these studies, we're looking at the response of the group. However, that doesn't really mean much for an individual because you don't know if you're part of the group that has a strong response or not. It's very hard to apply group statistics to the level of the individual because what these effect sizes, which seem to show a very trivial effect, say favouring naturally menstruating women in comparison to oral contraceptive users, that does not mean that every single person who takes an oral contraceptive is going to have a trivially reduced performance. What that means is if you take these 2 large groups, these huge groups of women who use contraceptives or don't, if you select people at random, you have a higher probability of selecting somebody with a higher performance in the naturally menstruating group. But there's going to be huge overlap in that. There's going to be any amount of women who are taking oral contraceptives who perform better than somebody who's taken naturally menstruating. This is these statistics are a broad look and they can't say anything about the individual experience of any one woman. And I think that's really important to consider in all of this research.
Absolutely. That was precisely the point I was looking for, Eimear. I mean, we can't just oversimplify things and just say what theoretically or biologically makes sense. And that example you've used of yourself and the other woman you were talking with was just perfect in showing this ambiguity. You can have a woman for whom the pill is just a breath of fresh air and takes away some really unpleasant symptoms, other women for whom the pill doesn't feel right, and other women for whom is indifferent, and performance might just follow this same pattern. And this is why a personalized approach according to the person we have in front of us might just be wiser than just assuming that naturally menstruating women always have a much better performance. And just to clarify one last thing, Eimear, was exercise performance consistent across the OCP taking days when compared to withdrawal?
Yeah, basically looking at all of the available data, performance looked very consistent across the oral contraceptive cycle. So for anyone that has the paper there in front of them, I'm now looking at figure 5. Which basically looks at oral contraceptive pill consumption versus withdrawal. So that will be those active pill taking days versus those inactive or pill free days, depending on where you are. depending on the type of pill you're taking. And if you look at that, it's pretty much zero. I think one thing to highlight here is keep in mind the scale is different in figure 5 than it is on 3 and 4. It had to be because the effect was so close to zero that the scale on the bottom line is small. So really you're looking at pretty much nothing happening there. Performance seemed to be quite consistent across the oral contraceptive cycle, which, as I said in one of my previous answers, is probably because although there is distinct profile and although there is hormonal fluctuations through these 2 phases, it's quite small. You wouldn't expect massive variation in the hormonal profile across these stages. And so you wouldn't really expect massive changes in performance either. So that wasn't really a surprise. So really seems to be very little going on there.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. The scale really is different on figure 5. So the effect is really, really small, although it may appear comparable to figure 3 and 4. So, Kirsty, now trying to make this more applied to the context of this podcast and the reality of cycling and endurance sports, did you perform any analysis for exercise outcomes that might be more relevant for endurance female athletes?
Oh, I'm really sorry to disappoint the listeners. So this is we find ourselves in quite a similar circumstance here as we did with the menstrual cycle meta-analysis. That like Kelly described in her episode, we initially sort of pulled out our outcomes and we coded them for endurance and we coded them for strength, and indeed we considered some subcategories underneath endurance, so what type of endurance based on duration and so on, and similarly for strength, whether it was maximum and so forth. But actually, I can make a short answer for once. The statistics showed that we could pool that information because there didn't appear to be any difference at that level of sort of strength versus endurance. So actually all the data that's presented in this particular paper is a pooling of the strength and endurance outcomes. So I'm so sorry for the cyclists listening to this podcast. You won't get anything very specific here for cycling performance, but I think what it will do is it's a start. It sort of gives us, I guess, a very top level indication about whether performance in general is affected. And what you could do is you could sort of really start to look at some of those included studies and go through them. So all the references are listed there, and there's some nice summary tables too. And you can go in and have a look at which studies potentially use cyclists as their participants, or if there are any performance sort of outcomes or performance tests which are relevant to you in particular. But just remember, those studies are likely to be of a small number. And then again, I'd ask you to look at the quality of those particular studies to make sure, if they're high quality, our confidence is a little higher versus whether they're moderate or low. And as such, our confidence in those findings is maybe reduced somewhat.
Sure, and I think this is something the listeners are quite used by now. There are many times in which we can't just adapt the results from the studies to the specific context of road cycling, and we need to speak in broader terms as we are now. So we are reaching the end of this episode, and we can start wrapping up here with the $1 million question. Much like with training according to your menstrual cycle as discussed in the previous episode, should we, in this weird year of 2020, be giving guidance or adapting the training protocols according to your OCP or non-OCP taking days? Eimear?
To put it simply, in my opinion, no. There's no need. I don't think the evidence warrants any kind of generalised advice regarding what you should be doing on particular days. Absolutely for the OC cycle, because there's really no evidence of anything, but I apply the same to the menstrual cycle. I think generalised guidance, I believe not only is it not warranted by the evidence, I also think it's not useful in that if we start telling people how they should feel on particular days or in particular phases, that has the danger of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. There is more and more evidence coming out about the effect of belief and expectancy on performance, both positive and negative. If you start telling a girl that, you should feel, tired or sluggish at a particular phase, she might believe you.
She will.
And she might have been feeling fine beforehand, but she might believe you. And that can then have a knock-on effect. So I think for me, generalised advice on adapting training protocols according to these phases is for me, not useful. I know Kirsty is something Kirsty feels very, very strongly about. So I think I'll pass over to you, Kirsty, to on that.
Oh, I think you've really given a really complete answer, and I wouldn't have too much to add. I completely agree. I think we need to be really careful right now about the message that we put out there. What we're really trying to do is to increase participation of females in sport. We're also trying to facilitate and I guess guide our elite athletes to, podium spots. So, we have a very positive driving force behind all of this, and I would hate to see any of that marred by I guess guidelines which are built on a poor foundation, so on a small amount of literature and on a small amount of poor literature. So I think we need to wait. I think I said this in my last podcast with you, Gabriel. We just need to have patience, and we need to trust that the research is coming and that the new research will be of high quality to give us good confidence in our findings. But alongside that, if we take an individualized approach, we can continue to move forward in a practice, I guess, setting while waiting on the academic research side to catch up. And I think both streams will complement each other, and I encourage people to do both. Certainly, I'm a research academic geek, and I'm guilty of it in the past of, not really looking for lived experiences. That's what I'm going to call it. And I know that Eimear touched on this already, but the lived experience of athletes is super important. And I think we need to marry the evidence from practice and these lived experience with what we see in the lab, because we know that whilst in the lab we can control lots of things and we can have good scientific rigor and robustness, but actually in the field we need to have what we call obviously external validity. So when we take you out of the lab and we lose all of the control that we have when we tell you what to eat and what time to go to bed and what to drink before the test, in the real world it's not like that. So I think we need to value and marry our lived experiences with the scientific evidence. But as I said, we need to wait and have patience, and the good stuff is coming. I promise. I know lots of really great researchers in this space. It's coming. I see it coming. But absolutely agree with Eimear. We're not there right now, and I think just be careful of the voices that you listen to in this space.
Wow, that was, fantastic point you've both raised right now. And I would agree that we really must be careful with the message we decide to pass on now, because as Eimear said, if we start telling people how they're supposed to feel, then that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in a particular situation that you would be feeling absolutely fine, you might just start feeling sluggish or with any other symptoms. So fantastic point there. Kirsty, since you have the mic now, you were talking about the challenges in marrying science with practice, and this reminds me of the paper to podium research from Professor Graham Close and James Moulton, where the authors brilliantly state that elite sport is a dynamic, unpredictable, and often chaotic, none of which can be interpreted by a two-way ANOVA or predicted from the controlled laboratory environment. So, Kirsty, what practical advice can you leave us with regarding this subject, especially for coaches looking to apply the research we've been discussing so far?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, let me say I love the paper to podium paper by Graham and James and their team. That's wow, great to be able to have a tool now to help us translate, as I say, this lab-based information into practices is fantastic. And so how are we going to do that in, specifically with OCPs and coaches? So it's very similar to my answer on the menstrual cycle. We just need to basically foster an environment where we have a real openness and transparency around talking about different hormonal profiles. So let's educate ourselves around the differences. So firstly, a coach needs to understand that when they look at a team of female cyclists, that they're not all the same, and they are likely to have different hormonal profiles, so they need to educate and understand about these different hormonal profiles. Then they need to separate out maybe their mindset around that. They need to talk and listen to their athletes about their lived experiences. Of course, it would be great if they were all reading our papers. That would be lovely, so that they've got some, I guess, academic and and research evidence to maybe guide some of their thinking. But yeah, talking and listening and responding to the individual, I think really that's the way forward for the coach. And maybe if I could just take one more sort of minute to expand a little bit. So where we were talking about tracking the menstrual cycle, so asking them when they're having their period, maybe tracking when ovulation occurs and so on. Actually, if you're a coach and you're working with an oral contraceptive pill user, I think it's a little simpler here. So really what you want to know from them is, if they're taking their 7 pill-free days and if they're experiencing a withdrawal bleed and if that's sort of affecting their mindset. But really, I think because of it, it's quite a consistent reproductive profile there. I don't think there's too much to consider. So I think just coaches knowing which type of athlete they have in front of them, what hormonal profile they have, and then just listening and talking to them in a very safe and comfortable way. Oh, and one more thing. So sorry. While we're talking about this, I think it's super important to mention that if a coach hears something from an athlete that, okay, I don't feel maybe 100% in the withdrawal phase, or, it takes me a day or two of pill consumption to sort of even out, we mustn't use this information against our athletes and sort of, sit them out or put them on the bench or, anything like that. I think, we can make small adjustments. I mean, if your athlete said they had a headache, right, you'd make a small adjustment. So I guess the thing I want to say, and it applies here and for the menstrual cycle information and community, is that we mustn't use this information to ever punish a female athlete. What we're trying to do is dial up any potential benefits and dial down any sort of negative ones. But it's never really an excuse to sit somebody out, unless, of course, they ask for that. So whilst we're having these honest and open conversations, we must make sure that there are no negative consequences as a result of that openness.
And to that, I would say touché. That was a fantastic overview, Kirsty, and much beyond all the statistics we've been discussing, that is the practical advice that should pass on to everyone listening to today's episode. And I will direct my last question to you, Eimear. What needs to change in order to have better studies entering the next meta-analysis on this subject?
Yeah, so I think what we need to be doing now is a lot of the studies included in the current meta-analysis are based on kind of cross-sectional, observational, more exploratory type research. And at the early phases of a research line, that is essential. We need that type of work. However, now I think in this field, it's time to move on to more carefully controlled studies that answer kind of more specific focused questions. Like, we know now that there is large variation here. What we need to find out is what's underpinning that variation, what's actually causing some women to respond, some not. So I think that's where we need to move forward to. I would really like to see this meta-analysis that we're doing in 2030, or maybe it'll be a bit after, to be largely based on randomized controlled trials where women are assigned to take either a contraceptive or a placebo. Ideally, these need to be randomized, they need to be double-blinded, and ideally they need to be run over long enough time periods that there's time for the woman who ends up in the active group, time for her body to adapt to the hormones that they're taking. I don't say that lightly. They're big, complex studies, but I think if we really want to get into the specifics of this, that's the type of work that needs to be done.
Terrific. Let's note it down. Kirsty, if it was not already clear by the first episode, if people want to get in touch with you or follow your social media interactions, where should people go to?
So you guys can find me on Twitter. My handle, Twitter handle is @Elliott-Sale. I believe that Gabriel is going to give you the spelling of that, because I'm quite greedy and I like 2 L's and 2 T's in my surname, and there's no hyphens. It's all very confusing. But you can follow me there, and I'll be tweeting about everything female that you can think of.
I will include it in the show notes, of course. And how about you, Eimear?
Also Twitter. I'm not massively active, but I am there. So it's @Eimear Dolan. Is probably the best place to get me on. And I suppose my research is mainly summarised on ResearchGate. I'm not a big social media person, so I'm not hugely active there, but you'll find me in either of those places.
And as usual, I will make sure to include the links of both your profiles. Ladies, this has been just wonderful, and it was a joy just being able to talk to you and learn from you about this topic. So thank you, Kirsty, for your double patience in both episodes and arm-wavering explanations that brought extra joy to this conversation. Thank you, Kirsty.
Oh, you're so welcome, Gabriel. It's my absolute pleasure to come and do this type of podcast, because it's really great to be able to, translate, I guess, the lab work I've been doing for 20 years and to translate it into an applied setting. So, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's really appreciated.
No, Kirsty, thank you for your time. The same goes for you, Eimear. I'm glad I was finally able to bring you to the podcast. So thank you for your willingness to share your thoughts with us directly from Brazil.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me here. I really enjoyed it. I love these chats. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Delighted to have you both. And I'll make sure to keep an eye out for your future research in this and similar topics. And I recommend the listeners to do the same. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gabriel.
Thank you.
And that does it for today's episode on the use of oral contraceptives and exercise performance in female athletes. I hope you all understood the main take-home messages regarding this topic, and that we cannot simply oversimplify things and say that naturally menstruating women always perform better than women taking oral contraceptive pills just because the former is a much natural hormonal environment than the latter. And aside from birth control, taking oral contraceptive pills might be beneficial to those women who experience really intense symptoms associated with menstruation, and if the contraceptive pills alleviate those symptoms, then that's the most favorable scenario to that person and explains the huge variation we observe in the studies. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Thank you for tuning in to Fuel the Pedal podcast, and I hope to have you here soon. Stay safe, guys. Over and out.